I woke before sunrise to the sound of coal trucks downshifting on Route 52, the same way I had for years. The house still smelled faintly of last night's coffee, and the radio on the kitchen counter hummed with static before settling into a local morning show. Nothing in the air suggested the world was about to fracture. Outside, frost clung to the grass along the hollow, and a thin layer of fog sat low between the trees, heavy and unmoving. I stood at the sink, watching my breath cloud the window while the kettle heated, thinking about nothing more important than whether I had time to run into town later for fuel. The news broke in pieces. First, a caller mentioning traffic stopped near Charleston. Then a clipped update about hospitals diverting patients. The host tried to keep his voice even, joked about panic selling, then went quiet when another alert interrupted him mid-sentence. Emergency tones cut through the speakers sharp enough to make me flinch. I turned the volume up and waited for something clear, something official. What came instead were fragments. Violence reported. Law enforcement overwhelmed. Shelter in place recommended, then revised, then dropped entirely. The signal wavered, returned, and wavered again. I stepped onto the porch and scanned the road. No trucks, no commuters, just fog and the low rumble of something far off, too deep to be thunder. My phone showed messages stacked on top of each other, most of them unfinished. A cousin asking if I'd heard anything, a former co-worker sending a video that wouldn't load. The battery indicator flickered between numbers that didn't make sense. I refreshed until the screen went blank. Inside, the power cut out without ceremony. The radio died mid-broadcast, leaving the kitchen unnaturally quiet. I stood there longer than I should have, listening for sounds that had always been there before. No hum from the fridge. No distant engines, that even the birds seemed to have vanished. That was the first moment unease settled in, not as fear, but as absence. Things stopping all at once. I told myself it was temporary. Rolling outages happened. Cell towers failed. I had lived through storms that left us dark for days. I moved through the house on habit, checking doors, gathering a few things I might need if I had to leave later. Wallet, keys, flashlight. The rifle stayed on the rack. Whatever was happening, it hadn't earned that yet. Around mid-morning, a single vehicle tore past the house, fast enough to rattle the windows. I caught a glimpse of its back end fishtailing on the bend. Then nothing. A few minutes later, distant shouting carried up the hollow, then stopped as abruptly as it started. I waited for it to resume. It didn't. That was when I understood the morning wasn't normal anymore. Not because of what I saw, but because of what never followed. No sirens, no response, no correction. Just quiet. Stretched thin and brittle, like something that would shatter if touched. I locked the door, stood in the center of the room, and realized every plan I'd ever made assumed help would exist somewhere beyond the ridge. That assumption was already gone. I looked at the clock above the stove and noticed it had stopped during the outage, hands frozen at a time that no longer mattered. The stillness pressed in, forcing me to account for myself, for where I was and what I could reach without leaving the property. I walked the perimeter of the yard, boots damp with frost, marking distances in my head, the shed, the tree line, the slope leading down towards the creek. Each familiar landmark felt exposed, as if the land itself had shifted allegiance. From the ridge, I saw a smear of smoke rising miles away, unsteady. It didn't billow like a fire meant to be seen. It crept upward, uncertain, then flattened under the low clouds. I watched it, waiting. None did. When I went back inside, I wrote the date on a scrap of paper and set it on the table. It felt necessary to mark the moment then. By late morning, staying put stopped feeling like caution and started feeling like negligence. I loaded the truck with whatever made sense without thinking too hard about it. Fuel cans, bottled water, canned food. tools I could justify carrying without slowing myself down. The radio stayed dead no matter how many times I turned the dial. My phone flickered between service bars, then dropped them completely. Whatever coordination had existed earlier was gone now, replaced by noise without direction. I eased onto the road expecting traffic. There was none. The absence felt wrong, like stepping onto a stage after the lights went out. A mile down, I saw the first car abandoned on the shoulder, driver's door open, keys still hanging from the ignition. Another sat farther on, nose buried in the ditch, rear tires spinning uselessly in the mud. No people, no explanation. I slowed, scanning the trees and the bends ahead, trying to read a pattern that wasn't there. Closer to town, the pattern appeared all at once. Vehicles stacked at odd angles across the intersection. Some running, some smoking. Others burned down to frames that still radiated heat. A delivery truck had jackknifed into a gas station canopy, tearing half of it loose. The pumps were dark, the storefront windows shattered. Someone had spray-painted warnings across the glass, words smeared into shapes that meant panic more than information. I didn't stop to read them. Movement caught my eye near the pharmacy. A man stumbled out of the doorway, clutching his arm, blood soaking through his sleeve. Another figure followed him, faster than made sense, closing the distance without shouting. The first man fell, the second didn't slow. I turned the truck around before my mind finished naming what I was seeing. Tires squealed. Something struck the tailgate as I accelerated, but I didn't look back. Every side road I tried fed into the same chaos. Wrecks blocking lanes, people running without direction, groups forming, breaking apart, forming again. A police cruiser sat sideways across Main Street, lights still flashing, doors open, empty. Sirens wailed somewhere deeper in town, overlapping until they blurred into a single, constant scream. No one responded to them anymore. I headed for the highway as a last option, hoping distance might buy clarity. It didn't. Traffic had collapsed into a solid line miles long, engines overheating, tempers flaring. People argued through open windows. Others abandoned their cars and pushed forward on foot, dragging suitcases that split open and spilled useless belongings onto the pavement. I watched a fight break out over a cooler, fists landing without restraint. When one man went down, no one helped him up. I rolled the window down and smelled smoke, gasoline, and something sour underneath. A helicopter passed overhead low and fast, banking hard before disappearing beyond the ridge. It didn't come back. The line of cars didn't move. Somewhere ahead, a gunshot cracked, sharp and isolated. A few people ducked. Most didn't. That was when the roads stopped being routes and started being traps. Too many people, too many unknowns. No exits once things turned. I backed the truck onto the shoulder, drove through a stand of saplings, and cut across a field toward an old service road I knew would be clear. Behind me, the highway dissolved into shouting and smoke. The service road carried me away from town, but not from the sense that the surface was collapsing under its own weight. I passed houses with doors hanging open, dogs loose in yards, alarms blaring without interruption. A man stood in his driveway holding a baseball bat, watching every car that passed as if deciding whether to swing. I didn't slow. By the time I reached the turnoff back towards the hollow, the decision had made itself. Staying above ground meant crossing paths with too many people whose priorities had narrowed to the next minute. The land I trusted wasn't the road anymore. It was whatever lay away from it, unseen and unused. I drove past my house without stopping, following the narrow track that led toward the hills. The truck rattled over washboard gravel, climbing steadily. In the rearview mirror, smoke smeared the horizon where town had been. Ahead, the trees closed in and the road thinned to nothing. I shut the engine off and listened. No voices, no sirens. Just wind through bare branches and my own breathing, loud inside the cab, The roads had failed. I needed somewhere they couldn't reach. I stayed in the truck longer than necessary, hands resting on the steering wheel while the engine ticked itself cool. The woods around me felt thicker than they had that morning, not changed, just suddenly aware. I had come up this way hundreds of times over the years, usually without thinking, following muscle memory and habit. This time, memory worked differently. It reached backward instead of forward, pulling something old into focus that I hadn't considered in a long while. The coal mine sat farther up the ridge, past a stretch of land most people avoided because it offered nothing easy. No houses, no cell service, no reason to linger. My grandfather had worked there before it shut down, back when companies still pretended they'd be around forever. I'd followed him once as a kid. Helmet too big, lamp too bright. My hand wrapped around his glove while he showed me where the walls still breathed if you listened close enough. When the operation folded, the equipment was stripped and hauled off, but the mountain stayed hollowed out, sealed only enough to keep casual trespassers away. I hadn't been inside since I was a teenager. Still, I knew the layout better than most, because family stories had filled in the gaps time erased. Main shaft sloping downward, wide enough for machinery once. Side tunnels branching off, some collapsed on purpose, others left alone because stabilizing them cost more than forgetting them. Ventilation shafts punched upward to the surface, hidden among trees and rock outcroppings. Water pooled in the lower sections, clean enough to drink if filtered. The place had been built to keep men alive underground for 12-hour shifts. That mattered now. What struck me wasn't nostalgia. It was geometry. The mine was deep, insulated by tons of rock, shielded from sight and sound. No windows, limited entry points. The kind of place no one stumbled into by accident. Roads didn't pass near it. Crowds wouldn't drift that far uphill without reason. Whatever was unraveling down below depended on movement, noise, visibility. The mine offered the opposite of all three. I climbed out of the truck and walked the tree line, tracing the faint path that led towards the old access road. It was overgrown, barely a road anymore, but I could still see where trucks had once cut grooves into the dirt. Leaves crunched under my boots, louder than I liked. I paused often, listening. Nothing followed. No engines, no voices, just the slope rising ahead, patient and unmoved by what was happening elsewhere. There were risks I couldn't ignore. Old mines killed people even when the world was stable. Gas pockets, weak supports, flooded sections. Going underground meant committing to a place that could trap you as easily as protect you. If the entrance collapsed, help wouldn't come. If something went wrong inside, there would be no one to hear it. But above ground, help had already stopped being reliable. The difference was control. In the mine, threats were limited and knowable. On the surface, they multiplied without warning. I thought about supplies, about what I had in the truck and what I could carry on foot if needed. I thought about light, about air, about time. Most of all, I thought about how quickly towns had turned hostile once rules vanished. People weren't the same when desperation stripped everything else away. Underground, the mountain didn't care who you were or what you wanted. It followed older rules. The decisions settled without ceremony. I didn't announce it to myself or frame it as courage. It felt like aligning with something that had already been decided by circumstance. The mine wasn't a plan. It was an option that existed when others collapsed. I locked the truck, not because I expected to come back soon, but because habits matter when everything else breaks. I adjusted the pack on my shoulders, checked the flashlight twice, and stepped onto the forgotten road. Each step carried me farther from the noise I'd fled, and closer to a place built to endure pressure. As the trees swallowed the last hint of daylight, I understood I wasn't choosing safety. I was choosing containment. And at that moment, containment felt like survival. The access road ended without ceremony, dissolving into packed dirt and stone where heavy equipment once turned around. Beyond it, the mine entrance cut into the hillside like a wound that never fully healed. Timber braces framed the opening, darkened by age and moisture still holding despite decades of neglect. A rusted gate hung crooked on one hinge, its warning signs faded until the words blurred into shapes instead of meaning. I stopped just short of the threshold, listening. The air spilling out felt cooler, heavier, carrying a damp mineral smell that belonged to places sunlight never reached. I switched the flashlight on and swept the beam across the mouth of the shaft. Dust motes drifted through the light, slow and deliberate. No movement answered it back. That silence was different from the quiet outside. It wasn't empty. It was contained, pressed inward by stone. I stepped closer, boots scraping gravel, and felt the temperature drop another degree. The mountain held its own climate. Inside, the ground sloped downward at a steady angle, wide enough that I didn't have to crouch. Old rail tracks still ran along the center, half buried under debris, guiding the eye deeper into darkness. I followed them without thinking, counting steps, marking distance by the rhythm of my breathing. The farther I went, the more the outside world loosened its grip. No wind, no distant engines, just my footsteps and the soft echo they carried forward. Every few yards, side tunnels opened into shadow, their supports bent or collapsed, warning without words. I didn't explore them yet. This wasn't the time to wander. I focused on the main shaft, on reaching a point where light from the entrance no longer touched the walls. When it finally vanished behind me, I stopped and turned off the flashlight for a moment. Absolute dark wrapped around me, thick enough to feel. My pulse sounded loud, intrusive. I forced myself to stand still until it slowed. Turning the light back on felt like reclaiming something small but essential. I continued down until the ceiling lowered and the walls tightened, then found a widened section where equipment had once been staged. Broken pallets lay stacked against one wall, and a steel hook still hung from a beam overhead. I set my pack down there, not because I was finished moving, but because I needed a point of return. From that spot, I could still hear the faintest whisper of the outside, a pressure difference more than a sound. It reminded me that the surface existed, whether it welcomed me or not. I marked the wall with a strip of tape from my kit, bright against the rock, then walked another 100 feet before stopping again. Each marker anchored me, turning distance into something measurable instead of imagined. When I finally turned back toward the entrance, the light at the far end looked smaller than it should have. Not gone, just diminished like a memory losing detail. I understood then that descent wasn't just physical. Every step under the mountain made returning a choice instead of an instinct. I picked up my pack, adjusted the straps, and continued downward, letting the darkness close behind me with deliberate intent. I reached the first junction where the main shaft widened, and old steel doors rested against the wall, left behind when the company pulled anything worth selling. They were heavy, scarred, and bent, but intact enough to matter. I dragged one into position across the lower passage, muscles burning as metal scraped rock. The sound echoed farther than I liked, then died quickly, swallowed by distance. When it settled, the door leaned at a shallow angle, creating resistance rather than a clean stop. That would slow anything pushing without collapsing under its own weight. I worked methodically, not because I was calm, but because haste underground turned small mistakes fatal. Timber beams lay stacked nearby, cut years ago and never used. I wedged them into place behind the door, bracing the pressure points where force would concentrate. Each adjustment changed the way the structure carried weight. I tested it with my shoulder, then again with a careful shove from my boots. It held, flexing without shifting. Farther upslope, I reinforced the entrance gate I had passed earlier. I didn't seal it completely, air mattered. Instead, I narrowed the opening, forcing anything entering to move single file and slow. Old chain, still bolted into the rock, gave me anchor points. I threaded it through the gate frame, cinching it tight with a ratchet strap from my pack. It wasn't elegant, but it was intentional. Barriers didn't need to be perfect. They needed to buy time. The work took hours, measured only by fatigue. Without daylight, effort replaced clocks. I paused often to listen, pressing my ear to the stone when vibrations traveled through the walls. Once, distant scraping answered back from somewhere above. It wasn't close enough to define, but it wasn't imaginary either. I didn't investigate. Curiosity got people killed. I focused on finishing before whatever moved found a reason to persist. By the time I stepped back to assess the layers I'd built, the mine felt smaller. Not in distance, but in possibility. Paths that had been open an hour earlier were now deliberate choke points. Movement required choices. That was the point. I marked each barrier with tape and chalk arrows, not for speed, but to avoid confusion later when stress would narrow my thinking. Sealing the mine changed the air, the temperature stabilized, and the faint draft that had whispered down the shaft shifted direction. I adjusted a vent flap deeper inside to compensate, using a rusted lever that still turned if coaxed. Fresh air continued to circulate, slow but steady. I sat against the wall and drank water, letting the ache in my arms settle into something manageable. When I finally shut the light off near the reinforced section, the dark felt different than before. It wasn't an absence anymore. It was a boundary. Everything beyond it belonged to whatever was happening above ground. Everything within it was now mine to manage or lose. I rested my hand on the cool steel, grounding myself in the reality of the choice I'd made. Going back up would require undoing work I might not survive reversing. Staying meant accepting the mine as more than shelter. It meant letting it become a line that divided what I could control from what I could not. I checked my pack again, inventory turning abstract into limits. Batteries counted, food weighed, tools reassigned roles they weren't designed for. I planned routes between barriers, rehearsing movements that favored quiet over speed. If something forced its way inside, I wanted distance before contact. The mine offered that through bends and grade changes I could exploit. I left markers at knee height, visible only if you knew to look. When I finished, I sat in the dim light and waited. Minutes passed. Nothing tested the doors. Nothing scraped the chains. The stillness held, not fragile but watchful. I took that as permission to move deeper, carrying the weight of what I'd closed behind me, aware that sealing the world out also meant sealing myself in. That balance would define every decision from here forward, shaping survival into a sequence of deliberate constraints, where endurance mattered more than escape and patience replaced hope entirely for now. The mine settled around me as night arrived, on the surface, though I only knew because my body insisted it was time to rest. Without windows or sky, exhaustion became the only clock that mattered. I chose a chamber not far from the main shaft, but offset enough that any noise from above would have to travel bends before reaching me. Old support pillars broke the space into uneven pockets, giving cover without creating blind corners I couldn't account for. I laid out my gear with care, each item placed where I could reach it in the dark without searching. Light stayed low, angled towards the ground to avoid casting long shadows that played tricks on the edges of vision. The stone walls held the cold steadily, not worsening, not easing. It felt honest in that way. I ate slowly, forcing myself to chew even though my appetite had vanished somewhere between the entrance and the barriers I'd built. Food was fuel now, not comfort. Sounds carried differently underground. Every shift of weight echoed back altered, delayed just enough to feel separate from its source. Water dripped somewhere deeper in the mine, irregular, impossible to predict. Each drop landed with exaggerated importance until I trained myself to accept it as part of the background. I learned quickly that reacting to every noise would hollow me out before anything else could. I lay back against the rock and shut the light off completely. Darkness pressed in, immediate and total. I counted breaths until the tightness in my chest eased, then counted again when it returned. The mind didn't threaten, it observed. That distinction mattered more than I expected. Above ground, danger moved and changed. Here, it waited. Sleep came in fragments. I drifted, woke, adjusted, drifted again. Once, a distant vibration rolled through the stone, subtle enough that I questioned whether it existed at all. I stayed still until certainty returned in the form of silence. Another time, my own breathing startled me awake, loud and unfamiliar in the enclosed space. Each interruption taught me something about how fear reshaped perception when nothing obvious fed it. At some point, my body surrendered. When I opened my eyes again, I felt no difference in the darkness, but my thoughts moved slower, heavier. Rest had happened, incomplete but sufficient. I sat up, stretched carefully and listened. The mine answered with nothing more than its constant, patient presence. That first night didn't feel like survival yet. It felt like initiation. I had crossed a boundary, not marked by daylight or distance, but by acceptance. Whatever the surface had become would continue without me for now. Down here, time belonged to stone and breath, and I would have to learn how to exist within that rhythm if I wanted the next night to arrive at all. I didn't move right away. After the first night, stillness felt earned, and rushing it would only blur details I needed sharp. When I finally stood, I did it slowly, letting my balance settle before committing weight to each step. The mine was quiet in a way that invited assumptions. I resisted them. Quiet underground never meant empty. It meant contained. Mapping came before anything else. Without structure, the mine was just darkness with memory holes. I started from the chamber I'd slept in, marking the floor and walls with small, deliberate signs only I would recognize. A strip of tape here, a chalk arrow there. Nothing reflective, nothing obvious. The goal wasn't speed, it was orientation under stress. The main shaft ran truer than I remembered, sloping gently, its rails guiding movement like a spine. Side tunnels branched off at uneven intervals, some reinforced with timber, others sagging where the mountain had reclaimed its claim inch by inch. I approached each opening cautiously, light angled low to read shadows before stepping inside. If the ceiling dipped or the floor changed texture, I backed out and marked it as unstable. There was no reward in bravery down here, only consequence. I counted steps between junctions, noting the cadence in my head, then repeated the distance on the return to confirm it hadn't drifted. Corners mattered. Blind angles created risk, but they also created opportunity if I needed to disappear from something following a straight line. I catalogued both. Where airflow shifted, I paused, feeling temperature changes against my skin. Moving air meant connection to the surface or deeper voids. Both carried implications I wasn't ready to test yet. Deeper sections told different stories. Some tunnels ended abruptly where collapses had sealed them off. Rock packed tight like a fist. Others opened into wider chambers where equipment once lived, now reduced to rusted outlines and scattered debris. I found a workbench bolted into stone, tools long gone but grooves worn smooth by hands that no longer existed. Those spaces felt watched, not by anything present, but by the weight of time that had passed through them. I stopped often to listen, not for sounds, but for changes. The mine had a baseline rhythm. Once I learned it, deviations would stand out. Water drips echoed differently depending on distance. My own footsteps softened or sharpened based on grade and surface. I committed those patterns to memory, building a mental map that didn't rely solely on markings that could be missed in panic. By the time I returned to my starting point, the mind felt smaller, not because it was limited, but because it was defined. Unknowns shrank when named. Paths became choices instead of guesses. I sat against the wall and reviewed the layout in my head, walking it without moving. That exercise mattered more than the tape on the stone. If I lost light, if markings failed, the map would still exist where fear couldn't erase it easily. When I finally rested again, it wasn't relief I felt. It was alignment. The mine was no longer a hiding place. It was a space with edges, rules, and roots. That made it something I could work with. And in a world where everything else had collapsed into chaos, having a system, even a fragile one carved into darkness, felt like the first real step towards staying alive. Once the tunnels had shape in my head, I could start assigning them purpose. Survival underground depended on systems, not luck, and every system leaned on another. Power came first, not for comfort, but for continuity. Light dictated movement. Movement dictated safety. I inventoried what I'd brought and what the mine still offered. Old conduit ran along sections of the main shaft, empty now but intact enough to repurpose. I strung low-voltage lines using scavenged wire, keeping everything modular so a failure wouldn't cascade through the whole setup. Batteries became currency. I rotated them, tracking usage by scratch marks on their casings, never letting one drain fully. Darkness was a tool when chosen, a liability when forced. I mounted lights where they defined space rather than flooded it, creating pools instead of glare. Shadows stayed predictable that way. Predictability mattered more than brightness. Air demanded respect. The mine breathed whether I acknowledged it or not. Ventilation shafts pulled and pushed with subtle pressure changes, influenced by weather far above. I learned their patterns by feel, not sound, sensing temperature shifts along my forearms as I walked. I adjusted old dampers, careful not to choke circulation. Stagnant air carried risks I couldn't smell until it was too late. I tested flow with smoke from a small candle, watching how it curled and stretched, memorizing the paths it preferred. Water came from the lowest sections, where seepage gathered slowly, filtered by layers of stone. I cleared a collection point, lined it with plastic sheeting, and let it fill without rushing. Patience improved clarity. I treated every batch, even when it looked clean. Illness underground wouldn't announce itself until damage was done. I marked the route to the water source carefully, knowing fatigue could turn a familiar path into a hazard. Each system worked only if the others held. Power let me monitor air. Air kept water safe. Water sustained the work that maintained power. I moved between them deliberately, adjusting one thing at a time, watching for unintended consequences. The mine responded with silence, which I learned to interpret as permission, not approval. By the end of the day, the space felt less borrowed. I wasn't just occupying it anymore. I was negotiating terms, setting boundaries, defining limits. That shift carried weight. Systems demanded maintenance, and maintenance demanded commitment. There would be no coasting once they were in place. I shut the lights down to minimum, sat in the steady airflow, and drank measured sips of water. The mine held. For now, so did I. Food was the easiest problem to misjudge because it pretended to be simple. Count the cans. Divide by days. Adjust for effort. On paper, it worked. Underground, time didn't move cleanly enough for math to stay honest. Without sunlight, days stretched or collapsed based on fatigue, and hunger didn't arrive on schedule. I forced structure onto it anyway, because structure was the only thing that kept need from turning into impulse. I laid everything out once, then packed it away so I wouldn't keep revisiting the total. Seeing the whole supply invited bargaining. I grouped meals by function rather than preference, assigning heavier calories to labor days and lighter ones to maintenance. Nothing was labelled by date. I didn't want to know how far the end sat from the beginning. I wanted each day to stand alone. Eating became deliberate. I stopped when fuel replaced hunger, not when comfort returned. The body argued at first, then adapted. That adaptation scared me more than the hunger had. It meant I was changing to fit the space, not the other way around. I logged intake with simple marks on stone, updating them once per cycle. Never more. Obsession wasted energy. Time needed its own anchors. I set a rhythm using tasks rather than hours. Wake, inspect barriers, check airflow, collect water, eat, work, rest. The order mattered more than duration. When exhaustion came early, I rested early. When it stayed away, I worked until it arrived. The sequence stayed intact either way. I noticed the difference after several cycles. My thoughts stopped reaching for the surface as often. The mind defined mornings and nights through effort and recovery instead of light and dark. That worried me, but it also steadied me. Panic thrived on uncertainty. Routine starved it. I marked a section of wall with deeper grooves, one for each completed cycle. I didn't call them days. Words carried expectations. These marks were proof of continuation, nothing more. When I reached the end of the row, I started another beneath it without ceremony. Food dwindled at a predictable rate. Time did not. Accepting that difference kept me from chasing illusions of control. I wasn't surviving by counting what I had left. I was surviving by matching consumption to reality as it revealed itself. When I lay down to rest, stomach quiet, muscles sore, I understood that staying alive underground wasn't about endurance alone. It was about learning which measurements mattered and discarding the rest before they pulled me apart. The first sound reached me while I was adjusting the vent flap near the main shaft. It wasn't loud enough to demand attention, which is why it did. Underground, anything sharp announced itself clearly. This was dull, irregular, as if the stone itself had shifted and then thought better of it. I froze, one hand still on the rusted lever, and waited for it to repeat. It did minutes later. A drag, followed by a pause, then another drag, closer together this time. The pattern didn't match falling debris or settling timber. Those were brief and final. This carried intent, however clumsy. I shut the light off and let my eyes adjust to the dark I already knew. Sound traveled differently without illumination. Direction sharpened. The noise came from upslope, near the reinforced sections I'd built hours earlier. I moved carefully, keeping to the wall, stepping only where I'd already memorized the ground. When I reached the first barrier, I knelt and pressed my ear to the steel. Vibrations bled through faintly, distorted by the brace points I'd wedged into place. Something pushed against the metal, not hard enough to break it, but hard enough to test it. I stayed still. Testing barriers was what I would have done if I didn't know what waited on the other side. Pressure came again, then receded. A sound followed that made my jaw tighten. It wasn't a voice. It was breath, forced and wet, escaping through something that no longer knew how to use lungs properly. I slid back from the door without touching it, retreating until distance softened the noise. Time stretched. I waited for impact, for a sudden escalation that never arrived. Instead, the sounds wandered, scraping against stone, bumping into the narrowed entrance above, then fading. I tracked them by echo, mapping movement the way I'd learned to map tunnels. They circled, returned, drifted away again. Persistence without strategy. When silence finally settled, it didn't feel earned. It felt conditional. I checked the braces, running my hands along each contact point, feeling for shifts. Nothing had moved. The structure held. That was the good news. The rest followed close behind. The infected knew the mine existed, not as a concept, but as an obstacle they could touch. They hadn't forced their way in, but they'd found the edges. That changed the equation. The entrance wasn't forgotten. It was resisted. I withdrew deeper, closing distance behind me rather than leaving it open. In the chamber I used for rest, I sat without light and listened again, committing the altered baseline to memory. The mine had new sounds now, layered over the old ones. Knowing them would matter. I didn't feel fear in that moment. I felt confirmation. The surface had reached down and brushed the boundary I'd drawn. It hadn't crossed it yet, but the pressure was real. I adjusted my routes, revised my assumptions, and accepted that the mine was no longer separate from what hunted above. It was simply harder to reach. I learned the mine could answer back the same day the sounds from the entrance stopped. It didn't announce itself with drama. It corrected me quietly, the way old structures do when they've tolerated just enough interference. I was crossing a secondary tunnel I'd marked as stable when the floor shifted under my weight, subtle but undeniable, like a breath taken where none should exist. I froze mid-step and waited. The movement didn't repeat, but the echo it left behind changed the tone of the space. I backed out one careful pace at a time, placing my boots exactly where they'd been seconds earlier. When I reached solid ground again, I shut the light off and listened. Stone adjusted around pressure in ways that sounded alive if you weren't disciplined about interpretation. A low groan rolled through the supports, followed by a series of sharp clicks that reminded me of cooling metal. The mine wasn't collapsing, it was redistributing weight. I marked the tunnel as compromised and rerouted my movement through a longer path that added distance but reduced risk. Efficiency mattered less than predictability now. Deeper inside, the air carried a sharper edge, faint but present. I recognized it from stories told in half sentences and warnings never written down. Gas. Not enough to choke. Not yet, but enough to demand respect. I adjusted dampers farther back, coaxing airflow without creating pressure that might destabilize weak sections. Water changed too. The collection point filled faster than it had before, the surface cloudier, disturbed by movement above. I filtered and treated it twice, watching sediment settle in unfamiliar patterns. The mine responded to changes whether I wanted it to or not. Every barrier, every rerouted vent, every footstep altered the balance that had held for decades. I was a variable now. Later, a distant collapse sealed one of the side tunnels completely. I felt it through my knees before I heard it, a soft punch that travelled along the rails and into my bones. Dust drifted through the air hours afterward, fine enough to coat everything it touched. I wore my mask until breathing felt normal again, then kept it on longer than necessary out of caution. I didn't mourn the loss of that tunnel. I documented it, updated my map and moved on. Attachment had no place underground. Space was either usable or it wasn't. The mine didn't care about intentions, only forces. I adapted my routines to account for that truth, limiting movement during rest periods when the mountain seemed most active, increasing checks after long stretches of stillness. By the time the air settled, the mine felt older than it had days earlier. Not weaker, just more present, less tolerant of assumption. It reminded me that shelter came with a cost beyond isolation. Staying alive meant listening to more than threats that moved. It meant respecting threats that shifted, pressed, and waited until attention drifted. I finished reinforcing a support beam near my sleeping chamber, driving wedges into place until the structure sang a deeper note. When it stopped changing under pressure, I stopped working. That restraint mattered. Forcing the mind to comply would only invite resistance. Cooperation required limits. As I sat in the dim light, the stone around me warm from effort, I understood something fundamental had changed. The danger was no longer only outside, pressing inward. It was also beneath my feet, responding to every decision I made. Survival would demand not just vigilance, but negotiation with a place that had endured far longer than I ever would. I noticed the first sign while checking the water route, a detail small enough that I almost stepped past it. A length of tape I'd placed low on the wall had been peeled halfway back, its edge curled with fresh grit stuck to the adhesive. I stood there longer than necessary, tracing the shape it made, replaying my own movements to be sure I hadn't brushed it without realizing. I hadn't. The placement was deliberate. Someone had touched it. I followed the route slowly, light angled to catch disturbances rather than surfaces. Footprints showed where dust had been compressed differently, not deep enough to belong to heavy equipment, not light enough to be old. They moved with purpose, favoring the same stable ground I had mapped for myself. That bothered me more than if they'd wandered blindly. It meant whoever came through understood mines, or at least learned quickly. Near one of the abandoned staging areas, I found a crate shifted from where I'd left it. The lid sat crooked, nails bent back instead of pried loose. Inside, 2 of my water filters were gone. Nothing else had been touched, food remained. Tools stayed where they were. The selection felt intentional, restrained. That suggested planning rather than panic. I backed away without replacing anything. Confrontation underground carried risks I couldn't afford. Sound traveled too well. Escape routes narrowed too quickly. Instead, I altered patterns. I moved supplies into smaller caches, spreading them across routes only I used, erasing the efficiency I'd built for myself. Convenience became liability. I shut down one of the light pools near the main shaft and listened from deeper inside, counting the seconds between distant movements. At one point, a faint cough echoed through the tunnels, cut short as if swallowed. Human. Alive. That confirmation settled heavier than any threat I'd faced above ground. The infected followed instinct. People followed need. Hours passed without further contact. When I returned to the sleeping chamber, a single mark waited on the wall near my pack, scratched into stone with a tool edge. It wasn't a message. It was a boundary, drawn where I would see it. Communication without consent. I erased it before resting, grinding the rock smooth until the symbol vanished into texture. Then, I sat in the dark and redefined the mine again. Not as shelter from the world, but as shared space where intentions mattered as much as defenses. The infected pressed from outside. Now someone else moved within. Survival had gained a second axis, one I couldn't reinforce with steel or timber. The encounter didn't happen where I expected it to. I'd assumed any collision would come near the main shaft, where movement funneled and sound carried far. Instead, it unfolded deep in a lateral tunnel I'd marked for limited use, a route I'd only taken twice since mapping it. That meant one thing immediately. Whoever else was down here had learned my system well enough to anticipate where I wouldn't be. I noticed the air first. It felt warmer, disturbed, carrying the faint metallic edge of blood that hadn't fully settled into the stone yet. I stopped, lowered the light, and listened. Breathing answered me, shallow and uneven, coming from behind a support beam ahead. Not infected. Too controlled. Too afraid. I retreated one step, slow enough not to scrape gravel, and shifted my weight to brace against the wall. Words formed and died in my throat. Sound was a liability here. Before I decided whether silence or speech offered better odds, movement broke the stalemate. A figure lurched into the light, not charging, not hiding, just collapsing forward under its own weight. He was younger than I expected, face hollowed by dehydration, eyes tracking the beam like it might vanish. One arm hung useless at his side, wrapped in a torn jacket stiff with dried blood. He froze when he saw me, then raised his working hand, palm open, fingers trembling. Whatever script he'd prepared for this moment had already failed him. I didn't lower the light. I didn't raise the rifle either. I kept it slung, visible, undeniable. Power had to be acknowledged before trust could even be considered. He swallowed and tried to speak, failed, then nodded once, a small motion that carried too much weight. Behind him, something scraped against stone, distant but real, reminding us both that stillness was temporary. The sound decided for us. He staggered closer, urgency breaking restraint. I stepped aside instead of back, opening the path past me deeper into the mine. Choice matters when everything else is forced. He took it without hesitation, limping past, leaving a dark smear on the wall as he went. I followed at a distance, counting breaths, tracking his balance, measuring how much danger he carried with him. This wasn't rescue. It wasn't alliance. It was collision under pressure. And the mine would extract a cost from both of us before it allowed anything resembling peace. We didn't stop until the tunnel narrowed enough to force single file. I took the lead then, not out of trust, but necessity. His pace faltered with every grade change, breath catching in a way that warned of collapse if pushed too hard. I adjusted without comment, slowing where the ceiling dipped, choosing routes that favored balance over speed. Behind us, the scraping returned, closer now, careless and persistent. At a junction I'd marked weeks earlier, I turned away from the path that led back toward my established space. That decision settled heavy in my chest. The deeper routes were less forgiving, less mapped, but they offered separation. I sealed a secondary barrier behind us, metal groaning as it took weight it hadn't felt before. The sound echoed like a challenge. Nothing answered immediately, but pressure followed, testing the door with dull insistence. The man sank against the wall, sliding down until he sat in the dust, head bowed. I checked his injury without ceremony. The wound wasn't fresh, but it was angry, swollen in a way that promised trouble. I cleaned it as best I could, using supplies I'd already decided to consider lost. When he finally met my eyes, there was no gratitude there, only understanding. Debt underground didn't feel like kindness. It felt like leverage. I moved us again once his shaking eased, pushing into sections where the air thinned and the floor tilted unpredictably. Each step carried us farther from anything resembling exit. That mattered. The infected followed lines of least resistance. So did people. Depth complicated both. When we stopped, it was in a chamber barely tall enough to stand in, walls close enough to press back when you leaned. I marked the entrance and dismantled the light behind us, erasing our trail. The mine closed in, protective and punishing at once. I looked at the man, then at the darkness beyond him, and understood what I'd chosen. Staying shallow meant contact. Depth meant isolation at a cost that couldn't be shared easily. I accepted it without explanation. Survival demanded fewer words now. Losses revealed themselves after the movement stopped. In the deeper chamber, quiet returned in layers, each one exposing something missing. I inventoried without ceremony. A filter cracked during the rush, useless now. One battery drained faster than planned, sacrificed to light the descent. Time bled out in the same way, spent all at once and unrecoverable. The man slept fitfully, fevered breath scraping his throat. I used the last of the antiseptic and tied the wound tighter than comfort allowed. Infection didn't care about sympathy. I watched for hours, learning his rhythms the way I'd learned the mine's. When he woke, he spoke his name once and didn't repeat it. I didn't offer mine. Names added weight. Depth took its own payment. Air thinned enough to slow thinking, not dangerously but persistently. I adjusted dampers and felt the mountain resist, then settle. Water was farther now, the route steeper, the return heavier. Each trip would cost more energy than the last. I recalculated rations, crossing out numbers I no longer trusted and replacing them with margins. The mine demanded attention everywhere. A support creaked near the chamber, a warning rather than a threat. I braced it with wedges cut from spare timber, shaping each by hand until the pitch changed. When it held, the silence that followed felt earned. Elsewhere, a collapse I hadn't heard sealed a passage I'd planned to use. The map in my head updated, shrinking again. He asked if we would go back up. The question hung there, fragile. I answered by handing him a light and pointing deeper. Explanation would have been cruel. The surface was a rumor now, changing faster than we could chase it. Down here, constraints were honest. By the next cycle, he could stand without swaying. He carried water slowly, carefully, learning the grades. I watched for resentment and found none, only focus. Cooperation underground was not companionship. It was alignment under pressure. What the mine took couldn't be itemized fully. It stripped options first, then comfort, then the illusion of reversibility. In exchange, it offered a narrow path that still existed when others didn't. I accepted the trade because it was the only one left. When I finally rested, back against stone, I understood that surviving here meant letting go of who I'd been above. Not dramatically, but piece by piece, until the weight matched the depth. I planned for the loss by changing habits. I shortened routes, reduced light, and shifted labor to cooler cycles when breath returned faster. He mirrored the adjustments without prompting, absorbing rules by observation. That mattered. Teaching wasted time. We set boundaries without speeches. Tools returned to the same place. Silence governed work. Signals replaced questions. When mistakes happened, we corrected them once and moved on. Underground, repetition bred complacency, and complacency invited injury. I recorded changes with minimal marks, refusing narratives. Each mark meant a decision had stuck. When doubt surfaced, I checked the marks and kept moving. Momentum counted. At the barrier behind us, pressure tested the steel again. Softer now. Intermittent. We listened together, separate, counting intervals. The sound drifted away. The mine exhaled. I reinforced one joint and left the rest alone. That night, if night was the word, I divided food into 2 equal shares and slid one across the stone. He hesitated, then nodded. Balance mattered more than charity. Sleep arrived later, lighter, but it arrived. Loss remained. But it no longer defined the space. It defined the cost. I accepted it as the entry fee to a depth that still held. Tomorrow would demand more, and I would answer with less, pared down to what worked. The mine kept taking. I kept adapting. Before resting, I reviewed contingencies, not hoping to use them. If barriers failed, I had distances. If air shifted, I had alternatives. If trust broke, I had space. None guaranteed safety, but they preserved choice. Choice mattered. I lay back, lamp dimmed, listening to stone settle. The mine answered with patience. I matched it. That rhythm would govern us both, demanding restraint, awareness, and humility, qualities the surface had discarded quickly, and qualities the depths rewarded without apology. Survival followed those rules exactly here. Stability arrived quietly, without the relief I once imagined it would bring. There was no moment where survival felt secured. Only a gradual narrowing of variables until nothing changed unexpectedly. The mine settled into a pattern, and we adapted to it without discussion. Routine replaced planning. Planning invited alternatives, and alternatives no longer existed. We divided tasks by capacity rather than preference. I handled airflow and structural checks. He managed water runs and inventory. Neither role implied authority. They implied trust built through consistency. We moved on staggered cycles, never working the same space at the same time unless necessary. Distance preserved focus. Focus preserved safety. Meals followed effort, not appetite. We ate facing different directions, lights dimmed, listening while chewing. Conversation stayed functional. Words described needs, not feelings. Anything else risked distraction. When mistakes happened, they were corrected once and folded into the process. Repetition meant we had failed to learn. The mind responded to predictability. Airflow stabilized. Minor shifts announced themselves early enough to manage. Water clarity improved as sediment settled into familiar channels. Even sound softened, no longer startling, but informing. We learned the difference between harmless movement and warning. That knowledge accumulated slowly, becoming instinct before it became conscious. Time lost meaning beyond sequence. We tracked cycles, not days, marking completion rather than duration. The surface stopped intruding on thought. When it did, it arrived as abstraction, stripped of detail. That absence felt less like loss and more like distance, a separation that allowed attention to stay where it mattered. The barriers above remained intact, tested occasionally, never breached. Pressure came and went without pattern. We adjusted nothing unless forced. Overcorrection invited instability. The mind rewarded restraint. Routine did not make life easier, it made it possible. Within it, effort balanced risk, and risk remained measurable. That was enough. Signals from above arrived rarely and without consistency. When they did, they slipped through the mind like rumors, distorted by distance and stone. A vibration carried down a vent shaft one cycle, low and rhythmic, not strong enough to identify, but persistent enough to register. We stopped work and listened until it faded, neither of us guessing aloud. Guessing created stories. Stories led attention away from what could be measured. I kept a small radio powered down most of the time, using it only during maintenance cycles when the airflow aligned favorably. Static filled the chamber when I turned it on, broken occasionally by clipped fragments that lacked context. A call sign without response. A burst of numbers spoken too fast to follow. Once, a weather alert repeated itself until the battery sagged and silence returned. None of it told us anything useful. It told us the surface still moved. We adjusted behavior whenever those sounds appeared. Movement slowed. Lights dropped to minimum. Barriers were checked without reinforcement unless necessary. The mind didn't need tightening every time the world above shifted. Reacting to incomplete information wasted resources. Waiting preserved them. One cycle, ash drifted through a ventilation crack, fine enough to coat the rock with a dull grey film. I wiped a finger across it and smelled burned plastic beneath the mineral scent. Something large had burned nearby. Not close enough to threaten the shafts, close enough to change the air. We sealed that vent partially and rerouted flow, watching the smoke test curl into new patterns before settling. Hope tried to surface during those moments, uninvited. The idea that order might be reasserting itself above ground carried weight even without evidence. I let the thought pass without feeding it. Decisions rooted in expectation had already failed once. Survival here depended on responding to what arrived, not what might. Listening became a skill separate from hearing. It required patience and the ability to discard interpretation. The mind translated everything into pressure, movement, and tone. I trusted that language more than words carried through broken systems. When signals stopped entirely again, we resumed routine without commentary. Silence didn't mean safety. It meant the surface had shifted beyond our reach once more. We accepted that boundary, maintaining readiness without anticipation. The mind remained consistent. That consistency earned our attention. I stopped thinking of the mind as temporary, long before I admitted it to myself. The shift didn't arrive with resignation or relief. It came through repetition of a different kind, the kind that reinforced decisions instead of eroding them. Each completed cycle without change confirmed what the stone had been telling me since the first descent. This place wasn't waiting to be abandoned. It was waiting to be accepted. I walked the deepest routes alone that cycle, not to escape company, but to measure how the space felt when I moved through it without urgency. The walls carried warmth where hands had passed often. The floor showed familiar scuffs where balance corrected itself instinctively. These marks weren't clutter, they were evidence of adaptation. I paused at a chamber I rarely used and shut the light off, standing in darkness that no longer pressed in. It simply existed. When I returned, we adjusted nothing. Routine held without supervision. That mattered. Systems that failed when unattended weren't systems at all. We shared food without calculation beyond balance, traded tasks without discussion, and corrected drift before it widened into error. Survival no longer demanded constant attention. It demanded respect. The surface still entered thought occasionally, stripped of faces and places, reduced to terrain I no longer needed to navigate. I didn't miss it the way people describe missing things. Missing implies expectation of return. I understood now that return was a story, not a plan. Stories changed too easily. Stone did not. I wrote nothing down. Records invited comparison. Comparison bred longing. Instead, I measured continuity through action. If the next cycle functioned, that was enough proof. At rest, I listened to the minds settle around us, small adjustments carrying through supports like distant speech. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't kind. It was consistent. That consistency offered something the surface no longer could. Limits that held. If this is where I stay, I will stay deliberately. Not hiding, not waiting, living within a boundary that doesn't pretend to be anything else. Survival doesn't always look like escape. Sometimes it looks like choosing a place that endures and learning how to endure alongside it quietly, without asking for permission from a world that already moved on.